Hi, Chris.
Hi.
It's very good to be here. We are CyberSync doing another podcast. And today, this is one of my favorite subjects. It's a bit sensitive, but we're going to cover it there.
Good.
Today, we're going to talk about sovereignty and digital resilience in the sort of bigger geopolitical context. Can Europe, for example, even build resilience outside the US tech stack? Is it even possible? And is it needed? This is the subject for today. So please tell me a little bit more about you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, I'm Nick Prescott. I'm a fractional CISO, so I work with a lot of US and EU companies. This kind of topic comes up the whole time is, the crown jewels, the confidential data, the transfer of data between US and EU. Really looking forward to having a good conversation about this.
Thank you, Chris. So to begin with then, is real digital sovereignty in Europe even possible?
I think it's really difficult because if you look at the big vendors out there, you've got what I kind of colloquially call MAGA, which is not Make America Great Again, but Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and Apple. The operating system that you work your machine on is either going to be Microsoft, Amazon, Google, or Apple, whether it's the end user device or it's going to be in the cloud. So there isn't really like a European end user operating system. There isn't a European only cloud-based hosting providers. So in terms of, sovereignty in that aspect, I think it's quite difficult to really say that, I'm going to use an EU-based desktop system where none of my data can ever kind of leave the economic zone of the EU. So.
No, no, certainly. I mean, to even see a world today without Windows, Google, and Apple, that's going to be tricky for any enterprise or any government entity. But I guess there is a middle ground here, or how do you see?
Yeah, there is. I think, if you look at what Europe did with GDPR, and you look at the Cyber Resilience Act that's come in place, the AI Act that's come in place, they have changed kind of the global stage in terms of moving our data. I mean, just remember when the EU said that all mobile devices needed to have USB-C, and even Apple had to change because they couldn't sell an iPhone in Europe, and yet they had the USB-C. So I think in many ways, whilst it, all the 360 million Europeans, they're using you've got 300 million American users, and what you've got is the scenario whereby we're using the US systems, but in many cases you're seeing that the European regulation has become a global de facto standard in making sure this data is processed fairly.
I guess it's also about resilience, isn't it? I know of several countries in Europe that they have to have this rule of 3 months of independent operations with pretty much the cables cut. I mean, I guess that means on-prem or
It does. It means on-prem. It means European clouds. It means, not kind of the cloud anywhere, anytime, and then realizing that your data is in a far-flung corner. So, again, with the EU, you kind of got DORA. So the more kind of critical you are to a national infrastructure, the more kind of resilient you have to be. So, I think, when you look at the difference between US and EU legislation, regulation, it's that the US are probably more prescriptive in the security control, where the EU are much more about the kind of practice of good resilience. So, operating in a kind of confined environment where you kind of, as you say, cut the cables. I think does provide challenges, but it also provides opportunity. I think so that not everything is all in one basket.
I mean, how can we sort of manage that very complicated middle ground of resilience, contingency in a world where we all know we are depending on one country?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
You've had the EU-US Data Privacy Act Shield, Schrems 2, and all that, and I think there's been a kind of slightly unholy kind of matrimony in terms of that because I don't think you're going to get a situation whereby there's going to be an operating system that is purely just going to work within the EU. There wouldn't be the market adoption for it. The Microsoft and Amazon and Google, and they are so intrinsically linked to our kind of global connected world. I think it'd be very, very difficult to completely shut it off. And I suppose on the other side of the flip coin, when you look at things like Russia and China, the Great Firewall of China, or something in like North Korea, where I think something on the BBC they were saying they bought a North Korean only OS, and you tried to put anything weird in there, and it auto corrected it and reported you for kind of trying to say these things. So that's at the other end of the spectrum. But I think there is, as technology evolves, the EU and the US will be similar and different, and they are in many ways. But I think when you look at things like Russia and China, Russia probably uses a lot of Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and Apple, but it's probably a little bit out of date now due to the sanctions. But America has a great kind of firepower in terms of not only trade sanctions but digital sanctions. And I think that is the case where one can't work without the other.
I have this feeling like, a lot of, both on government side and enterprise side, we don't want to sort of annoy our big friend in the West. But at the same time, people are starting to look at alternatives, but without saying. Because you see that in defense, for example, you see some big contracts shifting to more European alternative. I can see some of this happening on IT, cyber, but without literally talking about it because we don't want to annoy them. Is this something you see out there?
I think that's an interesting one. I think a lot because of a lot of the US tech companies' dominance in the market, they have a low entry cost. They want to get your data, they want to process your data, and I think they realise that operating in Europe, they've got to act within the law, which is annoying, I think, for some of the US companies because they may not have the same kind of operating model as the EU kind of countries would like. But I think there may be annoyances between the two, but I don't think America is going to ignore the EU market. They know that there's a lot of innovation, a lot of technical innovation over in Europe. And I suppose if you equate it with arms sales, a lot of, shutting down on trade borders and whatever. I think with data, it's slightly easier. I think with weapon sales, it's probably something slightly different. But I think under the hood, you have to kind of understand is that, that there is this kind of great kind of cyber war that's kind of always gone. Russia and China. And I don't think that's controversial to say they're trying to get trade secrets. And in many ways, it's the resilience of the US and EU systems is really key because on the geopolitical scale, people kind of say that whatever you build in the West, the China copies it 10 times cheaper. And I suppose in a way, it's a bit like things with EV cars. It's a well-known fact that China is probably one of the most polluting countries, but yet they produce the most electric cars, and they produce them a lot cheaper, and they're using a lot of their own technology. So, I think there's kind of lots of swings and roundabouts, but I think the US and the EU know that, in order for the cloud first, the AI type environment, and the direction that technology is going into, they kind of need to work together. So, working together is better than working apart.
No, certainly. We are all friends, but until we are not, and in that sense, and I can see many sort of new initiatives have developed lately. One of them is Eurostat, and all of this. Like they're trying to come together to create more alternatives, to not sort of be completely locked in to one country and so on. Do you think that will accelerate, or will this be sort of a thing for the past, and we will keep on doing what we do?
Yeah, I think it will accelerate, not because of technological advances. I think it will become because people will want to keep their data within their country. They'll want to keep their data, within the kind of sovereign area. It's just a shame that a lot of UK and EU tech companies tend to get bought out traditionally by Americans. What we haven't seen is EU companies buying US companies, and I think that might create a little bit of a friction. I don't see a, you, for example, I suppose in a way you've got Apple Music and Spotify. Spotify's Swedish, as we all know, and there's a bit of a friction there, in that kind of music streaming world. But what we haven't seen is, someone take on the Microsoft Google. There's no European Google. There's no European Oracle. There's probably a bit on the startup side, and they will satisfy niche markets. But whether they will compete with them on a global scale, I don't think that's the direction that many EU tech companies are going for.
No, it's a very interesting one because when you turn the table, so SAP, for example, it's a European alternative, and there have been American concerns to put the data in SAP systems. Because if you turn on the table and say, for example, healthcare data, NHS puts a lot of their healthcare data in American hyperscalers. Would you think that Americans would be comfortable to put their healthcare data in a German server?
Healthcare is an interesting one because if you look at the American healthcare stuff, they've got like HIPAA and HITRUST, and we have a slightly different way of doing it within Europe. It's more about data protection and medical confidentiality. So there's a lot more prescriptive nature, I think, in that. But I think you're absolutely right in terms of, would the Americans be happy storing their data outside the US? And a lot of them say no. We do not want it leaving the borders. I don't think there are many American healthcare organizations that have, US patients' healthcare data stored in a German data center. But I'm pretty sure that storing it in a German data center is probably just as secure as storing it in a US data center. So, there's a lot of kind of toing and throwing in that way. And, I think in terms of sovereignty, it's kind of interesting because, in terms of people, when people say that they want to keep data sovereign, it's like, well, it tends to be people's personal data. Well, I'm pretty sure that most people's personal data is probably scattered around a whole load of servers in the US anyway, because they've said they've already signed up in Microsoft or Google. I mean, no one, when they log on to Google saying, where are you storing my data? Because they won't tell you. And people are like, okay, well, that's fine. It's free for the user, but that user's data is being monetized by a lot of these big American tech companies. I mean, Facebook, no one said, well, I want my Facebook data stored in Europe. That doesn't happen. So I suppose in a way, again, it's quite a niche thing because it's businesses. You've got business data, confidential data, and sensitive data, and they want to kind of keep that data. But for the end user, I think if they really look at it, it's like, well, it's all out there. I mean, people are very willing to send a picture of their body part on Snapchat, and who knows where that goes. I think that's changed a lot. People kind of, well, don't post any picture on the internet because it's on the internet forever. And I think people have got beyond the stage of going, well, they know everything anyway.
Very interesting. I mean, I've seen this as a development every time from like, let's start at like Snowden and what happened there. Some people outside and started to get up, we know that, the US government probably were listening to a lot of things, but now it was more or less confirmed. And from there to where today we are, like, resilience is not only about we trust them or don't trust them. As I said, say China, Russia, or anyone else would cut the cables, then it doesn't matter if you trust them or not. There is a bigger picture here to be seen, isn't it?
There is. I think there's two underlying aspects to that, and that is that there is a lot of global to and fro. There's kind of espionage and counter-espionage on the cyber. People are saying that China is stealing trade secrets. Well, I'm pretty sure that the UK, US, the whole kind of Five Eyes arrangement, they're not listening in to what Russia and China. Of course, that's happening. But I think in terms of people's data and that being stolen and resilience and times like that is, there've been, I think there will come a point where there have been so many breaches, is you just have to assume that your data is out there anyway. That kind of conscience will get down to a lower level. I think people with the whole advent of GDPR, when it was a new thing, they suddenly realised that, hang on, they want to safeguard the data, and that's a good thing. But people say, oh, I'm really fed up with looking at cookies, and why do I have to click on so many things? And yeah, there are controls around personal data, but I think I probably started using the internet in about 96, 97. I got my first Hotmail address in 1998. I mean, my data had gone over to the US uh, in the last 27 years. I mean, am I going to suddenly start getting worried and going, oh, I want all of that back on EU shore? It's just not going to happen.
It was literally a continuation from ARPANET, from the US military network. So internet is a spin-off from a military US network. So yeah,
Exactly. Yeah. And you know, and I think, you know, when you think how the internet started, they were, you know, governments tried to kind of keep it controlled. And then all those early warriors just spread all the code out. So governments realized that they couldn't change it. And so I think from a geopolitical perspective, that's quite interesting because governments cannot control social media. They cannot control the internet. And in a way, it's kind of, that's kind of preserved democracy because people have that ability to speak out. But then at the same time, the government to realise, well, what we're going to do is just going to spy on each other and see if we can get that information from each other. But, you know, gone are the days where, you know, like take an example, Romania, Ceausescu, they could control the TV, they could control the radio. And if you look at what's happening in Russia now, you know, they're really trying to control the internet, but information does get around. So I think in many ways trying to safeguard information from a personal and privacy and healthcare and confidential thing, that's a great thing. But on the other hand, it probably enhanced democracy. It probably fostered greater understanding between countries. So it goes both ways.
now we're spilling into one of my favorite subjects, privacy, right? And with that said, my view on that is, you mentioned some, Russia, China, and others that clearly are looking into what their citizens do online and trying to control that. But just to finish off that, even if it's not exactly the subject, don't you think that we also do that, but we just click the terms and conditions and say, yes, here you are, then the data?
I think, you know, when it comes to things like data privacy, you know, people want to choose what data goes to who. You know, you know, if you, for example, I don't know, sign up with a furniture provider, you know, you don't want them suddenly taking your email and then trying to sell you camping equipment because you have a relationship with that company to provide you with a service. And I think people want to share data in a way that they have an engagement with a supplier or a limited company that is kind of controlled. I think people rightly get annoyed if that kind of spills over and goes somewhere else. But on the flip side of it, if you look at governments looking into people, there should be safeguards that, you know, people have the right to European Convention on Human Rights, people have the right to a private life, people have the right to a family life, and so therefore, you know, as long as you're not doing anything illegal for, you know, law enforcement purposes, then people's activity and what they do should be the same as taking their dog for a walk or seeing a friend. The government shouldn't be intrusive in terms of what they're doing. But I see what you get a lot of in terms of intelligence gathering is the difference between, you know, I was a lecturer a couple of years ago and they talked about the difference between mass surveillance and bulk surveillance. You know, I don't think Western governments are really into mass surveillance. You know, they're not kind of watching people go down the streets, but they have enough bulk.
It's interesting that you say that, because the direction seems to be going in that way, isn't it? Like when you see in the EU, you see the chat control, that cycle, and here you see some other acts in UK and so on. We're going towards sort of, should we treat the citizens as suspects before they are suspects? Shall we break encryption before we actually know you are or you're not a criminal? I would say we are going in that direction.
Yeah,
Maybe not fully there.
yeah, I think, you know, there have always been abuses of power in any kind of nation state dynamic. I mean, that's been consistent throughout history. But I think, you know, when it comes to things like protecting the public, so like terrorism type offences or, you know, mass organised crime, or when you're dealing with critical national infrastructure, you know, people do leave a very large information trail. And, you know, that's why you have RIPA in the UK, lawful intercept warrants and all that kind of thing. Yeah, you know, do we know whether they're used properly across all governments? No, we don't know. But I think criminals have got smarter as well. I mean, they tend to use the deep dark web for communication, index web, you know. So the ability to communicate without the watchful eyes of the government, but the government having ever better watchful eyes. There have been a lot of, I think Apple, threatened to pull, I can't remember what it was, but Apple threatened to pull some level of encryption from their iPhone. And then, the government backed down because they realized that it was an encroachment of civil liberties. Yeah. So,
To withdraw from Europe.
but I think civil cyber liberties are really really important.
Yeah.
You do need to be able to have that nation state keep that state control you know in check. And yet it's kind of steps being taken forward to protect it. But I think on the other hand is you know if I live outside London, if I go into London, I think there's something like 3,000 cameras watching every move I make. Yeah, every credit card, every time I blip my phone to pay for something, every time I send a message, it's probably geotagged or something. So my view is, are the government really interested in what I do on a day-to-day basis? Because there's 60 other million people in this country. I'm not doing anything particularly special, but there needs to be safeguards so that they don't kind of deny my liberty to live my life within the realms of the law.
Yeah, it's a hard struck balance, isn't it? Because in essence, you maybe or maybe not trust your government today. You might or might not trust your government tomorrow, and whoever you are, and so on.
But I think that's a really interesting point you mentioned there, because I think if you think of, maybe it's nostalgia, but if you think of the way people trusted their political parties, you expected them to do good. They were elected by the people, for the people, with the people. But then again, you see all these scandals because, like, Boris Johnson was WhatsApping, and, Donald Trump and Hegseth were like, talking about things. So even government are using social media methods and
100%. You need surveillance methods like spywares, Pegasus, etc. Yeah. And you saw some examples when clearly it was placed on devices by the opposition in some countries. I'm not going to go into which one and so on. I'm going to get called out for that. But there you see, even in democracies, it's already going over that balance.
yeah, and I think they're abuses. I think if you are the Android and iOS, the mobile systems, there needs to be regulation that the good guys are protecting against the bad guys, and we all know that there are companies that put these spyware on. That's clearly ethically legal and morally wrong to do so, and but I think there's also a public consciousness issue. People pick up their iPhone like 50 to 100 times a day. They're on their phones for 4 to 6 hours a day. Are they looking at every click going, well, who can possibly do that information? People forget it becomes the norm, the amount of sharing of your personal life with a digital device, and that's all tracked. That's all logged and monitored somewhere because someone is monetizing it through marketing. I think people don't think of these things. You and I might think of these things because it's our profession, it's our career, but I think a lot of people, they just, well, I just want to get from A to B. I want to chat with my friends. I want to see what the coolest new thing is.
As I said, I think today a lot of us in this type of Western society, we sort of give away our data, just clicking terms and conditions in our sort of, Microsoft, Apple, Google. We can't avoid it because it's part of our day to day. And on the other side, on the flip side, you have access to that data today, and that's the scary bit when it's come in. And I mean, I'm not sure everyone is aware of that. You are, I am. But it's definitely an interesting aspect when it comes to privacy and boundaries.
I think when you look at social media companies and the way they want to monetize about user habits and what people search on and things along those lines. That's just them trying to find ways to monetize the data. But look at the flip side of it. Are we really going to get can a caveman live in the 21st century? Can they walk into a bank with no form of identification and get cash? A lot of bars and restaurants, they only accept contactless. You can only pay for a certain amount of things in cash. You can't drive unless you've got some form of ID. That's kind of logged somewhere. So I just think there's a general trend of society that you cannot avoid this kind of digital age because you simply cannot function in a modern society. But then again, are those safeguards at the right level in terms of everything from a geopolitical nation state level down to an individual level? I don't think that will. Who knows what will happen? But I think it will be a constant cat and mouse game.
Love this subject, Chris. Let's round it up. If you would look a little bit into the future, would you say what direction are we heading, short and medium term, in the ways of looking at sort of both from a sort of European point of view, but also in data privacy? Where are we heading really?
I mean, one thing we haven't mentioned any of this podcast is AI, and maybe that's by design or a mistake here. But if you look at the way AI is going and the way in which people are using AI, and no one really has a full understanding of when they take your personal data in AI, how is that workflow traced? How can you delete, the hazing and the doxing of those models within AI? So I think that will change, and I think also AI will, make people more dependent on the digital age and not less dependent. People will become lazy. I mean, people won't work things out for themselves because things will be worked out for them. So I think something's fascinating. I think someone's bought Johnny Ive's company because they're doing this little kind of tablet that will be more powerful than a mobile phone. I mean, I'm not entirely sure what it is, but this whole concept is that AI will just be such an intrinsic part of our life is what will be private? Nothing. I remember talking to someone fascinating in the intelligence community, saying, you have your personal life, which is your private life, your public life, and then your secret life. And I think, your public life is more and more digital. Your personal life is what we choose to share in that public life. But the secret life, the people that no one else wants to know about, who knows if that's going to be a secret any longer?
100%. I mean, just to promote, we actually did cover a bit of AI in another of the podcasts we had done for today. So I recommend to listen to that. But I would also say, spot on, that will change the world. And I also have already pitched my opinion about this. I'm sure you've seen it online. There's this square sort of camera always on devices that you're going to wear with the microphone, and you can, in essence, it will see and hear and interact with you constantly, 100%. Would you let someone in your house with wearing that, and very well that everything is recorded, and I can tell you already, no.
Exactly.
Leave that by the door.
But people have got like Ring doorbells, they've got indoor cameras, everyone's carrying a camera phone on them. I mean, who knows?
Fantastic. Thank you so much for participating.
Thank you very much.